Hello folks, Jerry here and welcome to the second part of finding out what the best car of Racing Rivals was. Today we're gonna go through the polls which have been posted on my YouTube community tab for basically the entire month. We're gonna go through, what cars you guys voted for, which are going through, which are some of the favorites, and which have been eliminated. So this was the very first post that we didn't cover in the first part, so feel free to check that video out. If you guys want to participate in these posts, they are running daily on the community tab of my YouTube channel, but if you vote on them, they should pop up in your feed naturally. So let's start off here with the R3 class Lambos. Now, Racing Rivals had a lot of, it had 4 basically R3 class Lambos, which I think is the most of any brand, but honestly, for me, none of these are really elite picks, but you guys voted for the Veneno and the Sesta Elementor the most, even though it was very close. I really thought that the Huracan GT3 would come in clutch, but yeah, unfortunately that car has been eliminated. Moving on, we had a battle of the A-Class campaign cars and the Camaro, which has previously won in the previous round. Anyway, the Acura NSX absolutely dominated over here, and honestly, I was expecting for the challengers to put up more of a fight, but no, the Camaro prevailed, and honestly, out of these, I would have to say that the NSX and the Camaro would be the ones that would move in my opinion, so yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong here. This one was quite a bit more interesting though, because we had a bunch of meme cars in Racing Rivals, and for me, the choice was relatively simple. Top Fu is obviously going to move on. I think that's that's basically the meme car of Racing Rivals, but shockingly enough, the second place goes to the Bosozoku, which, oh my god, I mispronounced that. I honestly thought it would go to the Suteresa, but no, that, along with the Golf Harlequin, have unfortunately been eliminated. And honestly, there's been quite a few really controversial polls, I would say, but we're gonna get to those. Anyways, next up we have another pretty straightforward one, the McLaren 12C and the ZR1. Yes, I think that it's completely fair that those two moved on, but honestly I want to give a shout out to the Viper ACRX. That car was really slow for S-Class, but man, it was so nice to drive. The Challenger Hellcat, unfortunately, just I don't think it was in the same league as the other cars here. Next up, there are gonna be a bunch of these R2 class turf car polls. This was the very first one, and I think potentially the easiest out of the bunch. I'm really happy to see the C6R move on with no opposition whatsoever, but the second place was actually quite close between the NSX G3 and the RX-8. Honestly, I really didn't like the way the NSX drove, so I was hoping that the RX-8 or the Megane would move on, but the NSX does edge them out at the end. Okay, so here is a particularly painful one. I think this one was the first poll that really just kind of made me sad, because the cars moved on here were the Cobra Jet and the SVT Cobra RE, and I would have to say, if it was up to me, I would pick the cars that actually didn't move on here. The Mustang Race Edition, yes, of course it's slower than the SVT Cobra RE and they look similar, but the R-Class Mustang Race Edition was honestly one of the first turf cars that inspired me, to basically want to get a turf car, and it was just such a iconic car in my opinion. And the Mustang Rivals Edition that you guys can see here was actually the very first car that I won when turfing, so I had a lot of attachment to that car as well. But the Cobra Jet and the SVT Cobra RE do move on here. Obviously I'm just biased, so any pick here is completely correct. So there will be other Mustangs that will be moving on forward, so honestly I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, this was a massive one. So basically a poll of all the starter cars from Racing Rivals, and you could only pick from 3 when you started playing, and that's because at the very beginning you could pick from either the Dart, the Civic, or the Scion, but the Scion was eventually replaced by the Jetta, and honestly, yeah, no shock, the Civic Si of course takes this one, but the Jetta actually ends up taking second place. If it was up to me, honestly I would have to pick the Civic and the Scion, even though it's kind of funny because when I started playing the game initially I actually picked the Dart, so yeah, that's a fun fact for you. Anyway, next up. I honestly didn't expect this poll to go the way it did. I just thought that the GNX would actually run away with it, but the RX-7 actually takes the first place here, which is kind of shocking to me because in my opinion the B-Class RX-7 kind of sucked, but oh well. I do have a lot of fun memories with the FPV and the M3, so it sucks that those two get eliminated, but hey, at least the GNX moves on. Okay, so this one is actually really interesting because somehow this is actually the most voted for poll that we've had in this series so far, so that's kind of interesting. What's also interesting is that both versions of the Ford GTR actually move on over the you know, Mustang Race Editions, which is not something that I was anticipating. So yes, there's now multiple versions of the Ford GTR in this ranking basically, but there will be basically a battle of the Ford GTRs a little bit further in these pictures here. So next up, yeah, some S-Class turf cars, and this is really interesting because we had two classic turf cars and two new age turf cars, you know, those being the 206 WRC and the Corolla, and we actually end up getting a mix of the two with the Corolla and the Scion TC GT spec moving on. I'm really happy to see the TC get some love. I think that was one of the most forgotten or like unknown turf cars in racing rivals, and I honestly think that that car kicked ass, so I love to see that it has moved on. Shout out to the Evora. I think that's actually the most forgotten turf car of the entire game. Who really has given any thought to the Evora in like the past 8 years? I don't know, it's kind of sad. It was a cool car, just didn't get much love back in the day, nor did it get it now. Okay, battle of the R3 race cars. So it's actually kind of shocking is that out of these cars, the 787B was probably the most irrelevant in racing rivals, but you know, it's a 787B, so it automatically moves on, which I think is fine. The other three cars were actually shockingly close, with the evasive S2000 actually getting the second place, which means that the GT race car and the Nissan R90CK have unfortunately been eliminated. I don't know, I kind of feel bad for the R90CK. I think that that was probably the most popular car out of all these, but you know, it is what it is. Next up, okay, JDM C-Class cars. This was actually a really close one, but eventually the Honda S2000 did end up running away with it, with the Eclipse getting second place. Now, I'm perfectly happy with that because I have the most attachment to the Eclipse and the S2000, so honestly, pretty happy about the way this one went. Next up, oh god, yeah, this was gonna be a bit of an interesting one with the Ferraris. Now, I think that it was fair to assume that the 599XX would end up running away with it, which is the case, but the top three cars were actually very even for a very long time, and honestly, I was just terrified that the 575 GTC would end up moving on, because that car was probably my most hated car in the entire game. I mean, it was slow and I hated how it drove. Thankfully that car has been eliminated along with the Testarossa, which is a shame. I really like the Testarossa, but the 458 Italia does move on. Okay, A-Class turf cars. There were actually 4 that haven't been, you know, voted on until this time. So the WRC01 ends up moving on. That's pretty cool, and the M5 as well. I'm quite happy with those two, but I think that the Ferrari 250 GT is the car with like the least overall votes in this entire series, with it only getting 2% of the votes. I mean, Jesus Christ. It just goes to show, I mean, that car was, I think, released like really late into the game's life cycle, so most people don't even remember that car existing. Next up, oh yeah, this one was kind of sketchy for me because the McLaren P1 ended up running away with it. And for a while it seemed like the McLaren 12C GT3 might overtake the 2017 Ford GT, and oh boy, like, if the 2017 GT was eliminated in the very first round, I would be depressed. Thankfully, it does end up getting second place, and yeah, I think that this was actually one of the more interesting rounds. Next up, oh god, there were so many versions of Dom's Charger in this game that it's actually insane. I actually had to cut some out. Here were basically the 4 most notable ones, and I would say that the 2 which are actually the best for driving were the Ice Charger and the Steel Charger, but because of the looks, the Daytona gets second place, which I think is pretty reasonable. Oh, this one was tough. So basically I keep track of all this stuff, and I've seen that for basically the most of the cars which weren't voted on for D-Class so far were Honda, so I was like, okay, I have to pair them up against each other, which was tough. All of these cars here are very special. The CRX was one of the most underrated cars in the entire game. The Civic Type R Motorsports was the fastest D-Class car in the entire game, and the Civic Type R and the Civic Si, I mean, do I even have to say anything? I think that the way it eventually ended up is actually alright, but it's kind of interesting how much the Si Devil actually outperformed the Civic Type R. Still though, they both move on, and those two will eventually have to go against the regular Civic Si, which I think is going to be a very, very interesting matchup. Next up, okay, the R2 class M3 battle. The M3 Rivals Edition and the M3 G2 from the showroom are the ones that ended up moving on. Now, the Rivals Edition and the M3 G2 Google Play Edition actually have the same percentage, but in the comments more people spoke highly of the M3 Rivals Edition, so that one moves on. It's kind of interesting, you know, that the M3 G2 actually had a turf version at some point, but yeah, a lot of people didn't really care for that, so this is the way it is. Next up, oh my god, this is actually one of the most shocking ones. So we had a C6R Limited and another version of the C6R go up against 2 versions of the C7R. And the regular C7R won by a landslide. And what I find the most shocking in these polls so far is that the C6R Limited actually got more votes than the C7R Limited, which in my opinion was one of the most iconic wraps of Racing Rivals. So yeah, the C7R Limited, it's out. Also the C6R WWE is unfortunately voted out, but that means that there are still 2 C6Rs in these polls, with it being the turf version and the limited. So that's pretty cool, but in my opinion it's shame about the C7R Limited. Okay, this one was a bit more straightforward, with the CSL and the Pro Car being eliminated and the SLS and the C-Class DTM, I think, rightfully moving on. Oh, this one was actually pretty interesting because at the very beginning the Chevelle actually got very few votes, but it ended up making a comeback, which means that both the Turf Ford Falcon and the Focus RS500 are unfortunately eliminated, but the Mustang GT, I think, rightfully moves on. Okay, another battle of the R2 class turf cars, except I actually made a small mistake here. The Cyclone Racer Edition was actually not R2 class, it was only R class, but for the sake of this video, let's just say that this was still, you know, the matchup. Anyway, the MR2 Rivals Edition takes first place here, with the second car being the Pagani Huayra BC. I was actually really expecting that the GNX would move on, but it is eliminated along with the Cyclone. Okay, so we had a bunch of S-Class cars here, and it's actually really interesting. The GTR Nismo absolutely takes the cake with 74%. That's one of the highest scores that we've seen this far, and the second place was actually extremely close between the Gallardo Polizia and the NSX, but in the comments a lot more people voted for the NSX, so that car moves on. Okay, so we had another battle of X-Class here. I think there's only gonna be like 1 or 2 more X-Class rounds, but for the sake of this one, the Golf W12 and the Alpine move on, which I think is pretty shocking because I thought that the GT concept would get more votes, but apparently not. Shout out to the Silvervolt, I think it actually did pretty well. Okay, so here we have another poll that I don't really agree with. I think the Valiant HR was one of the best R-Class turf cars. Not because it was particularly special or good looking, but just because it was so amazing to drive. And honestly, I really liked the way the Bentley drove as well, but those 2 cars are actually eliminated because the Corvette and the Firebird got more votes. I mean, still though, I do have to say, the rims on the Bentley are pretty much the worst I've seen in the entire game. Okay, so here's the battle of the 4 GTs that I was talking about, and this poll is actually really interesting. I was certain that the GTR Limited would win by a landslide, but instead the one that actually takes the cake is the WWE one, which means that the GTR is the final WWE car to be in these polls. The turf version, actually the both turf versions get eliminated, so still though, I'm just happy that the GTR Limited is still in the running. Next up, Battle of the R-Class Turf Lambos. Actually pretty interesting. The Aventador actually takes almost half of the votes, which I find very interesting because I didn't like that car at all. For no other reason than it just looks proportionately wrong. I never liked the Aventador in the racing rivals, or this turf version at least. But along with that car, the other moving on is the Gallardo Superleggera RE, which, you know, that car was really quick, so I think that's pretty reasonable. So yeah, here's a bunch of cars that I couldn't find good pictures of, and I don't think it's a shock that the M3 RE actually moves on, but the M5 actually goes along with it, so the 2 BMWs end up making it forward, with the Chevy Nova and the Ford Mustang Rivals Edition actually getting eliminated. Okay, bunch of rally cars here. I was actually thinking that the Exige would do better than it did because that was one of the fastest cars for A-Class, but no, that's actually eliminated along with DS3 WRC. I was kind of rooting for the DS3 because that's actually a car that I had in real life. I mean, obviously not the rally version, but still. The 2 cars that end up moving on are the 037 and the Renault 5 Turbo Race Edition. I think that's fair though. Okay, so here is the last poll that we're actually gonna be, you know, seeing the 4 results of, and I think it's actually a massive one. This was one of the toughest polls that we have seen so far, and honestly, I did not expect the results here. So the Honda HSV actually gets the most votes with 41%. And the other car that ends up making it is the Caddy. That's shocking to me, because that means that the Corvette Daytona project and the AMG CLK GTR are actually eliminated. I was honestly expecting the complete opposite. I'm really happy about the Honda moving on, but I'm really sad about the AMG not making it. But look, it is what it is. Who knows? Still, shit, like, well played to the Caddy. I think that one was an underdog that ended up taking the whole thing. And here's actually today's poll, just for reference, a bunch of different Civics. Yeah, and the SI Race Edition is currently in the lead with 78%. I think that was to be expected. If I had to vote for one car that I would like to see move on here, it would be the R2 Class Type R RE. I really think that thing was a complete unicorn and very much underappreciated, but it is what it is. Guys, if you want to cast your vote on what were your favorite cars on these polls, make sure to leave a comment. If you want to participate, these are happening basically daily. If you want me to change up the way that we have been doing this, please also let me know. I am open to suggestions, but honestly, I'm just really happy that this thing took off the way it did. So yeah, just really happy, you know, that we get to talk about the cars of Racing Rivals after all these years. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Jerry, and hopefully I'll see you next time.